Welcome to USA Watchdog. I'm Greg Hunter. There's about 5 or 6 guests I tell you about that every, 6 weeks, 4 weeks. People start emailing me. People start commenting on the website, on the YouTube channel to get this person back. Get this guy back. Where is he? And I'm talking about Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former assistant Treasury Secretary in the Reagan administration. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, thank you for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, I know you have a very deep resume, editor at the Wall Street Journal. You have a PhD in economics. Yeah, I'm just grazing over your resume. Your father of Reaganomics. You know a lot about money, and I think that's what a lot of the problems around the world really are about. But I want to start, when we did the pre-interview, I said, I guess we'll talk about, maybe Russia. And he said, well, a lot can happen between now and, then. And sure enough, last week, Russia, imposes these sanctions back on the West. It's $17.5 billion worth total, the brunt of which is not going to fall on countries like the U.S. and Canada, but the European Union, the biggest exporter of agricultural products to Russia. I have read an AP story saying that, this really won't hurt. This will hurt Russia more than the European Union. And I'm thinking, what? Anyway, what say you about this tit for tat? We're back to, now Russia is putting some pretty heavy sanctions, and it's fallen on the EU. What say you?
Well, I think that the Russian government had to do that in order to stop the sanctions from accelerating. Europe is not used to being independent or having its own foreign policy. It has its foreign policy dictated by Washington. And so Europe has never had its heart in these sanctions. And Europe doesn't gain from the conflict that the United States is creating with Russia. They only lose. And so I think Putin realized that if he does nothing, then the United States will be able to pressure Europe for more sanctions. And so he's showing Europe that this can bite back, and they're not particularly inclined to cooperate with the United States on this matter. And so I think he made the right decision, or the Russian government made the decision. He's not a dictator. And that this will cause the Europeans to realize that agreeing to the United States setting their foreign policy is very expensive to them. So that may cause them to resist or to assert their independence. Some of the countries that are hurt the worst are the smaller ones, like Greece and Austria. And they're right now extremely angry because they're already in difficulties, especially Greece. So this anger will spread, and it will reverberate, and it will work to Putin's advantage, not to Washington's.
What are your sources saying? I mean, you have global sources. People are pinging you all the time. What are you hearing about how this is going over in Europe?
Well, it's not going over. It's not clear because the European press always follows Washington's line. But now we see a major break. Today, I think it was, Handelsblatt. This is the main financial newspaper of Germany. It's like the Wall Street Journal of Germany. And it came out with a very strong statement by the editor-in-chief that the direction that the United States was pushing things is contrary to common sense, and it's contrary to the interest of Germany. And so we've now had possibly the major voice in the media in Germany come out and say, we can't go along with this. It's time for Germany to find a more sensible course. And that this policy of the Americans of always escalating every conflict is the kind of nonsense that gave us World War I. And we've never really recovered from that. And therefore, this is a break in the ranks. And this is, as I say, is probably the most important newspaper in Europe.
Could this undermine NATO? I mean, is that what Putin is going after? In my weekly news wrap-up last week, there have been kind of speculation that, Putin may invade. Wesley Clark says, oh, that would have unimaginable consequences. And I'm thinking, does he have to invade, or can he just wait till winter? I mean, did everybody forget that he supplies massive amounts of natural gas to Europe? I mean, what happens this winter when people are heating their homes and businesses and Russia says, hey, we're not going to give you a deal on this gas. You pay double or triple, or we're sending it to China. I don't know.
I think the talk about Russia invading, that's the American military security complex, so they can beef up their budgets and have more taxpayer monies allocated to the military security complex. It's just propaganda. And of course, the British Defense Committee is following the same line. So we have a tiny little Britain talking about how it's got to step up and protect Europe from Russia, as if Britain could do that.
But you say that's just, they're not going to, in your mind, they're not going to invade. Russia's not thinking about invading.
Russia's not going to invade anyone, and I don't think they're going to turn off the gas unless the Europeans allow themselves to be pressured again into further sanctions by Washington. If that happens, I think that's when, and I don't even know then if the Russian government will turn off the gas. They're most likely just to call up the European capitals and say, look, you're going to get the gas turned off if you don't find your own independent foreign policy and deal with us like grown-ups. As long as you sit there and aid and abet the fools in Washington every time they escalate something that is about nothing that we can't resolve. I mean, nothing has happened, and it's all propaganda. So if you keep aiding and abetting the Americans in escalating a molehill into a mountain, then you're going to find yourself without any energy, because we're not just going to sit here forever and let you act like a child. So I think that's the most likely thing that the Russian government would do, and I think at that point the Europeans would realize they're being forced into actions that are of no benefit to them whatsoever and are entirely part of Washington playing the bully, trying to dominate other countries. So I don't think this is going to work out well for Washington. What I'm afraid of, Greg, is that Washington is reckless. And as the Handelsblatt, the newspaper itself, said, Washington doesn't have any diplomacy. It uses force and threats. And it's not smart enough to have diplomacy. And the danger of force and threats is they can lead to war.
Yes.
And so this is the issue that I've posed, and this is the issue now that the main German financial paper, Handelsblatt, is posing, and it will cause a lot of thought. It's very well written. It shows a level of intelligence far above anything you can find in the American media. I mean, the people at the New York Times or the Washington Post, these people, compared to this editorial, they couldn't write anything that good. So I think it's going to cause a lot of thought, and it shows the kind of leadership I was hoping would come out of Germany. So this editorial, putting its foot down, saying, we've got to say no to the Americans. This is not in our interest. It's not in the interest of the world. It's not in Europe's interest. I think this is a good sign, and it could well be that this will blow over because Washington has behaved in such an unreasonable way. You know, they've caused a crisis with no evidence. just propaganda.
Well, and that's what I've been saying, that apparently somebody wants war, whether no matter who shot this jetliner down, which now they can't even do a good investigation because they're being shot at, allegedly. And so it doesn't make any difference. It appears that one side wants to escalate this and move it up, and apparently that is the United States.
That's always Washington.
Well,
Washington is always the one that escalates everything. It's clear Russia doesn't want war, and China doesn't want war. But because of the recklessness of the Bush and Obama regimes, both China and Russia have been upgrading their strategic nuclear forces. And there's a news report that I saw today that the Russians have not only been upgrading their strategic nuclear forces very rapidly, but they've been running their strategic bombers into our air territory to test our reaction times and to test the response system here. So clearly the Russians are aware that the United States may intend war with them. And the Chinese are also.
And what do you make out there testing our airspace? Are they giving them a signal that if you have war, we're going to fight back? Is that what they're saying?
I think it's more than a signal. I think they're trying to read the capability that the United States might have to protect its airspace from strategic bombers. Because, the Russians have the strategic bombers, they have the ICBMs, and they have the submarine-launched ballistic missiles. So I think this is just, we're going to be sure we can get through with everything. And so, they have to be prepared when they're faced with what looks to them to be a drive by Washington toward war. Because there's no, look, suppose the Russians shot down the airliner. It's not worth going to war with. What does the United States care about an airliner? Look at all the people Obama and Bush have murdered in the last 10 years.
It could have been shut down by...
There's endless numbers of women and children, and all of a sudden say, oh, we're so upset about 290 people who aren't even Americans.
And it could have been shot down accidentally by the rebels, or it could have been shot down accidentally by... It could have been an accident.
Airliner is not important.
I think they want war no matter what. We agree.
It's just a plug for Washington to hook propaganda to. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't matter who shot it down, or if it was shot down or not shot down. It only matters for the people that died and their relatives. And it's unfortunate.
Yes,
but it's not anything you can expect the United States or anybody to go to war over. So it's just a propaganda hat that Washington is a horn they blow. In fact, all the evidence is that it was shot down by 2 Ukrainian fighter planes. This is the evidence. The fuselage has been examined. There are machine gun bullets in it. You can tell by how the metal behaves where the bullet went in, where it came out, and apparently was hit on both sides. So that means the Ukrainians did it, and that means we're complicit because they wouldn't have dared do that without our approval. So if anybody shot down the airliner, it was Washington and the stooges in Kiev. But we can forget all about the airliner. It's not important. What's important is when Washington telegraphs to 2 major nuclear powers, Russia and China, that it intends to attack them. And that's what the fools have done in Washington. And so I've just described to you the latest report of the Russians testing our air defenses. But you may have remembered, I think it was last year, that the Chinese, when it came clear that that Washington had war plans to attack China, an analyst wrote an article in the Yale Journal of International Relations and said, who gave the Pentagon permission to draw up war plans to attack China? and it became something in discussion. And China, their response was to reveal their submarine capability to take out the entire west of the United States, and their ICBMs that would finish off the rest of the country. They kept all this secret for years. And they revealed that these nuclear submarines that carry these multiple entry warheads on their missiles. They showed every western city would be ashes. They showed their ICBMs, how they would come over the North Pole and wipe out the entire east coast of the United States. Why would they do that? They did that because the fools in Washington are making up plans to attack them. And so they reveal this to try to wake up people here to stop the madness. That's the only reason for them to do it. So we have the two nuclear powers sending us all kinds of signals. Look, we know what you may be up to. You're not going to get away with it. Well, you got to ask yourself, what kind of president could be so reckless and so irresponsible as to make two nuclear powers fearful of suffering a nuclear first strike? Because that's a very dangerous situation. You know,
it could end life on the planet.
It could, if they decide that the crazies in Washington are going to nuke them, they may decide to nuke us first.
Yeah.
So throughout my lifetime, every American president took great care never to telegraph to the Soviet Union that we intended to have a nuclear strike. We explicitly made our war doctrine that nuclear weapons could only be used in retaliation to a nuclear attack. And the Russians did the same thing. So that, in effect, took the weapons out of the war doctrine. They existed only in order to prevent the other side from using them. So this was called mutually assured destruction, and it meant that you couldn't you couldn't use them. Well, what the Bush administration did was to get rid of that doctrine and elevate them to preemptive first strike. So that's now our war doctrine. The Russians have known this now for several years, and now they see they're being demonized, just like Iraq, just like Libya, just like Syria, just like Iran. In 3 of those 4 cases, the demonization was a prelude to being attacked militarily. So they're nervous. They're very alert. And this is dangerous. All of the threat of nuclear war had been ended when Reagan and Gorbachev made the agreements. And now this fool in the White House has brought this threat back. And the fool before him, Bush, George W. Bush, they have now restored the danger of nuclear war that had been pushed away.
And one smaller note, a follow-up on a smaller note, I should say, is the sanctions that Russia has put on. This is going to hurt Europe. I mean, could this implode their economy? Just the limited sanctions Putin and Russia put on Europe with these banning these foodstuffs, agricultural products?
No, but what it does, it hurts sectors of some European economies, and none of these economies are in good shape, other than more or less Germany. All the rest of the economies in Europe are not in good shape, and so it means the sectors that are hit by the sanctions are going to be in worse shape. And so all of those people in those sectors are going to be complaining. They're a political force. They're going to be complaining. They're going to be saying, what are we suffering this for? What is being gained? What does our country gain from America bullying Russia? We don't gain from this. We're losing. Why are we part of this?
So just enough to hurt them, to wake them up, but not enough to implode them.
Oh, it's not enough to implode anybody, but it's enough to hurt suffering. It may implode those particular sectors.
Okay.
But not the overall economy, but it's going to hurt those sectors, and their voices are going to be raised, and they'll get sympathy because, from their fellow countrymen. And so it's going to adversely impact on Washington, because the only way Washington can hurt Russia is to hurt Europe.
Oh, that's brilliant. The only way Washington can hurt Russia is to hurt Europe. I like that.
It's clear. It's the only thing that can be done.
That's brilliant in its simplicity, my friend. I want to move down to ISIS. Two big stories at the end of last week, or in last week, Russia. Mind-boggling stories. They have these people stranded on a mountain in northern Iraq. They're having humanitarian aid given last week, and then the president starts bombing ISIS. And of course, then almost nearly immediately, a few hours later, ISIS says they're going to have sleeper cells attack America. They're going to raise their flag over the White House, and we are back in Iraq in a big way. Can you give me just your feelings about ISIS and Iraq and this? The Islamic State in eastern Syria and western Iraq. They hold about a third of each country, huge, and been going on for a while. And the Obama administration is like, wow, what? We saw this on Twitter. Whatever. I mean, what's going on?
Well, certainly ISIS is not going to have terror attacks in the U.S. and raise the flag over the White House. If they said that, it's just boasting to their followers. Most likely they didn't say it, and it's something Washington made up in case they need another false flag attack. They'll have somebody to blame. Now, what is going on there? You see, the Middle East, the Muslims, they're different sects. And we've talked about this before, and the two biggest are the Shia and the Sunnis. And these populations vary. In some countries, the Sunnis are majority. In others, the Shia are majority, and they are opposed to one another. And so everything was okay with Gaddafi in office, with Saddam Hussein in office, with Assad, because they suppressed the conflict of the sects. And to the extent that these were dictatorships, that was the purpose of the dictatorship. And they weren't dictatorships, strictly speaking, but they had authority and they could suppress the conflicts between these sects. And so the conflicts were basically starting to mellow out. There was some, in Iraq, there was actually a marriage between Sunnis and Shia. And I don't know the extent of it, but there was. And so the whole thing was starting after many centuries to calm down. So what happens? Washington goes in and removes Saddam Hussein from Iraq, removes Gaddafi from Libya, and tries to remove Saddam, but at least starts a war in Syria by importing these jihadists that we are supposed to be fighting. And we use these are the jihadists, the so-called terrorists. We use them in Libya.
That's right.
To get rid of Gaddafi, and then we said, okay, now let's use them in Syria to get rid of Assad. They weren't up to that because we weren't able to go in and bomb the Syrian armed forces like we did through NATO to Gaddafi in Libya, because this time the Russians and Chinese said, no, you're not going to do that again. You fooled us once, but not twice. And so, since Washington was unable to support the mercenaries that it sent into Syria from the air, the Assad military was rolling them up. Now, what appears to have happened is, in all of these conflicts, finally an Islamic group has risen whose intention is to alter the colonial boundaries in the Middle East established by the British and the French.
ISIS or the Islamic
And
State?
ISIS, it's almost kind of like Muhammad has appeared again. It's a religious movement. It's got sincere adherents. They appear to be effective fighters. And they are creating a new country, partly out of Syria, partly out of Iraq. Now, they appeared suddenly. The United States didn't expect this. it shows the ignorance, basically, of Washington, because it just relies on threats and coercion. So it doesn't need to know anything. So this group has now come up. It's militarily effective, and the Iraqis can't deal with it, and apparently the Syrians only in part can deal with it. And so I don't think the United States will be able to deal with it, because I think it represents a change in the thinking and behavior of those people.
Do you think we're going to start bombing them routinely now, or?
Yeah, they'll do that.
And that's going to ramp everything up, wars, rumors of wars, more fighting, more killing.
Well, if we're going to bomb them and also fight in the Ukraine, we have our hands full. But the point is, I don't know that the bombing will succeed, because this is not an established regime. This is a new force that obviously has a lot behind it that no one suspected. So, and you know, they're outnumbered, yet they prevail in military conflicts. So I would think what we're seeing is a change in mind in the Muslim world. You see more and more people saying, look, we've been dominated by these Westerners for too long. We're not accepting it anymore. And so it'll probably spread. It may spread into the oil emirates, into Saudi Arabia.
That's what I was going to ask you. Could they knock out my thoughts? I'm very worried about Saudi Arabia and them taking over and knocking out the royal family, and whoop, there goes all that oil. And I mean, they could do that, couldn't they? And that's where Mecca is.
It's hard to know, because not much is known about them, and anything you hear from the American media will be propaganda and nonsense. That's all you ever hear from the American media is propaganda and nonsense, and from Washington it's propaganda and nonsense. I think what you're seeing is a new movement, and it's forming up, and usually these kinds of movements, they can't be stopped. And what will happen is they'll just get more determined.
You think they'll knock out Saudi Arabia?
It's entirely possible. You know what? Washington created the environment for this to happen. You see, without the attack on Libya, without the attack on Iraq, without having organized the attack in Syria, this movement would not have been possible.
But we were funding the Al Qaeda rebels, and this is
it's not just a question of funding, Greg. We caused a change in their minds, and in their hearts, and in their being. They're thinking different. They no longer accept what they used to accept. Their anger is spreading from against each other to the West. And so they're unifying people who used to be at each other's throats to get them unified against our throats.
Of course, they're killing some Christians. Crucifixion, beheadings. I mean, they're pretty brutal. They put their stuff on YouTube. So,
see, they're no more brutal than we are. They're catching up with us.
Well, I mean, last time I checked, the U.S. military doesn't behead and it doesn't crucify people. So
it doesn't matter. We blow them up with bombs or missiles or white phosphorus or depleted uranium. I mean, the brutality of the United States military towards civilians is probably unrivaled, except for the Israelis. So what this has done is not just that we went out and stupidly financed people to go attack Gaddafi and Assad. What we've done, for being over there for all of the 21st century, blowing up things, giving orders, blah, blah, we've created a mindset of we're going to get independent of governments that have been created and dominated by the West. So,
That's a big idea, my friend. That's people are hearing it here first. That's a big idea. That's the best. That makes sense to me. That just makes sense.
That's what's going on, in my opinion.
That makes sense to me.
It's not just a bunch of ruffians or something.
No, they're organized. No, I got that. And which brings me to my next question. As a former assistant Treasury Secretary, I mean, wars, nuclear wars, China, Russia, testing our borders, all this stuff going on, financial wars going on, gold, flatlining. What's going on with the gold market? I know you've written a lot about how it is manipulated. I mean, a lot of people have stopped saying it's not manipulated. Because, you have done a bunch of work, you and some other folks that you write with, it's obviously manipulated. What's going on with the gold market? When does it break out? Why shouldn't it be going off like a rocket? I'm asking a ton of questions at one time. Tell me about gold.
Well, every time it breaks out, the Federal Reserve has the bullion banks go in and short gold in the futures market. You see, as we've discussed before, I think, the price of gold is determined in the paper market, in the futures market, which is used mainly for speculating on the price of gold. Very little of these futures contracts that trade on COMEX in New York, very little of that is ever, very few of those contracts take delivery in gold. They're settled in cash because it's basically a speculative mechanism. It's not a market used by people who really want to buy gold and take it home. The people who buy gold take it home, they get it in other markets, like the London market. So, since the price of gold is not determined in the markets where people actually buy it, but in this futures market, then you can suppress the price of gold by shorting the market. And I've explained on my site with charts, Dave Kranzler and I, how this works. And at any time gold starts moving up, in come the shorts. And they always dump huge numbers of shorts at the least opportune times, that when trading is essentially non-existent, in the middle of the night, or when there's nobody buying and selling. And so the effect is to drive down the price. And once the price is driven down, then stop loss orders are triggered, and that's more selling, and then margin calls, and there's more selling. So then the people who have dumped the contracts can go in and buy everything up now at a price below where they dumped the contracts, buy back the contracts, and actually make money on the deal.
How long can they do this for? Because at some point, people like even yourself have said it. At one point, it'll stop. And Jim Rickards thinks the price of gold will be way higher in the future in dollar terms. And a lot of other folks think at some point it's going to be a snowflake moment, and you won't be able to run into that asset. Do you still think it's a good thing to have in your portfolio? And how long can they do this for?
They can do it as long as it's tolerated. And I don't mean tolerated just by the authorities, because in my opinion, it's strictly illegal. But since it's approved by the Federal Reserve because it helps them maintain the value of the dollar, they're not going to do anything about it. So it can continue as long as it's tolerated. When will it cease to be tolerated? I think that is when there is a general flight from the dollar. Because as long as the flight from the dollar is limited to people who want to move into gold, which is a small percentage of people, they can control that. But if there's a general flight, if people say, well, look, all these other countries are ceasing to use the dollar as reserve currency, India, Russia, China, they keep printing dollars, the American economy is not going anywhere, We better take some steps to get rid of all these dollars we've already got. We better find something else. Once the general move away from the dollar, not just by gold investors, but everybody, they say, well, I think I'd rather have fewer stocks and something else, or fewer bonds and something else, some kind of foreign holding, or gold, or something. And they cease to hold dollars, then this won't work. It'll fail. And at that time, they're going to find, in my opinion, almost impossible to get into gold, because it just isn't enough to absorb a major flight from a currency as large as the dollar. The dollar is just a huge currency. It's been spread around the world since the end of World War II, 1945. I mean, how many people are, it's been going on so long, and when all these dollars out there, and just a small amount of them in each person's hand, they say, well, I want to lighten up. That's a tremendous flight, and where does it go? And if it tries to go into gold, it won't be able to get in, and the price will just go through the roof. Now that's the way I see it. Now, when is it going to happen? I don't know. It won't happen as long as people are happy that the stock market is rigged because it's going up. They don't care if it's rigged if they're in it and it's going up.
Which is makes me very nervous to be in any kind of a rigged market. That always makes me, if I was an investor, I invested all my money in the site. But if I was an investor, I'd be very worried about a rigged market, because rigged markets can go sideways and sour in a hurry, right?
That's right. And they're rigged in many ways. I mean, you may have seen the report recently. I assume it's correct, that the biggest purchasers of U.S. stocks are the corporations buying back their own shares. Well, in other words, the companies are being decapitalized because they're buying back their shares. They're using their cash resources to buy back their shares, plus many of them are borrowing from banks in order to buy back their shares. Well, this decapitalizes the company. And it builds up debt, but it doesn't build up investments to earn profits to pay back the debt. So if you see that the biggest purchaser of stocks are the corporations buying their own shares, well, this tells you that the price of the Dow Jones is unrealistic. It's more reason it's up there. It's because corporations are buying themselves up. They're becoming less public companies because the shares are being bought in. Well, this is not a good sign. When you also see that most of the trades on the stock market are based on computers, on mathematical models run by computers, and that the whole thing is run by a model and not by the market traders. And when you see that most of these trades are people trying to front run other trades by having the fastest computer, by having your computer located as close to the source of information as possible. And so what you're trying to do is your computer can pick up the trade is being placed, you can get in front of that trade and affect the price. So all of this is like insider trading, but it's done in nanoseconds on fractions of a cent. But in large numbers of shares, that adds up to lots of money. Well, that is not a sound way to value companies, people. In other words, they're not making money based on the performance of companies. They're making money by front-running trades. Well, this is not a sign of a healthy financial system.
And you think the stock market it's going to blow when the dollar blows? I mean, we're going to have a simultaneously a daisy chain of the The dollar, one of my guests, Fabian Cabo, thinks it'll all blow up. The dollar, the bond market, the stock market, everything will blow at this, sequentially or at about the same time. Is that what you're saying too?
I can't see any other way. I mean, I don't know whether the stock market will blow first or the dollar. See, Greg, whatever blows, it has to be something that the government can't rig. You see, if the stock market starts going down, what the government does, they go in and buy S&P futures. They come in and buy futures of the Standard & Poor's. That pushes the market back up. So if the government is willing to do that, it prevents falls. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. What's your scenario? It can't go on forever. So what's your scenario for it blowing up? There is going to be a black swan and uh-oh moment at some point.
I think what they can't control is the flight from the dollar. They can't do anything about that. They can't print foreign currencies and go buy up the dollar. But they can go in and place huge orders for S&P futures to boost to the stock market.
So the dollar's the linchpin.
I think the dollar is the weak point. I think see, they can support that too and have been, because they get the Japanese to inflate and buy dollars, or they get the European Central Bank to inflate and buy dollars, or they get the European Central Bank, the Japanese Central Bank, to have a currency swap with the Fed. Federal Reserve says, here's $100 billion, give us the equivalent in your currency. And then the Fed can use the currencies it gets through currency swap to go in the market and purchase dollars whenever the pressure pushes the dollar down. But there's got to be a limit to Japan and the EU central banks' willingness or ability to do this without getting in the same fix that we're in. So I think that's the limit. And I think these sanctions are putting more and more pressure on the dollar because it encourages the movement away from using the dollar payment system. If you're not in the dollar payment system, the financial sanctions can't reach you. So, in a way, the belligerence that the Obama regime is showing to Russia is working against the strength of the dollar. Now, additionally, of course, it helps because everybody says, oh, there's going to be war. Where can we go? They flight to the dollar. America's safe. Flight to the dollar. That's always the initial response to a troubled international world is, oh, go to the dollar. But on second thought, you have to realize there's where I really go. Look at the poor condition. So I don't know. It could go on longer than we can imagine. In fact, it already has. I've told you before.
Yeah. A lot of people have said that, going on a lot longer than they thought. But when it stops, a lot of folks say when it stops, it's going to stop. It's going to end quickly and badly.
That's my view. Because the only way it can stop, it means the government can no longer rig it. And it's such a huge pile of cards that if they can't keep it rigged, a lot is coming down.
In a hurry.
In a hurry.
And the final thing, just a quick comment on this 4%, growth that we got in the second quarter. I haven't even talked to John Williams about it, but he's already saying that the economy remains in trouble. His work, which I'm going to go with him. You've said the same thing. The economy is in trouble. You think this 4% is going to get revised down pretty hard? This growth, so-called growth in the second quarter of GDP?
If it's honest, it'll be revised down. But there's a lot of pressure on them because you see that can be a black swan event. You get a second negative quarter, you're talking about recession. And then you're talking about, well, why are the stocks so high? And then people start bailing out of stocks. And since it's rigged, you don't know how big the crash will be. So I don't know that we can expect an honest number, but I do know that nothing has happened since the forces that produced the negative first quarter. There's been no growth in real consumer incomes. There's been no growth in consumer credit. We see not only have middle class stores like Sears and Macy's and J.C. Penney, not only are a lot of those stores being closed, but now we see it's the dollar stores are failing. So that tells you that people don't even have enough money to keep the dollar stores in operation. So where did 4% growth come from? Where's the spending? I would imagine a lot of it is involuntary inventory accumulation. You know, companies believe the propaganda, oh, it was just the winter, it was the cold weather. So they kept on making stuff to sell when the cold weather's gone. And there's nobody buying it, so it goes in inventory. You see, inventory accumulation counts as GDP growth. But it can be very misleading because it's production they hoped to sell and didn't. It's gone into inventory.
Huh. I guess so.
And so usually the response to that is that you cut the inventory the next quarter. You cut the production the next quarter because you got everything in inventory already. So when you cut the production the next quarter, then that quarter goes down to make up for the quarter that was up because you had to accumulate all this inventory. Now that's one easy way to understand what could account for that number for the second quarter. But to repeat myself, if you try to see what caused a turnaround of almost 7 percentage points from just about -3 to +4, that implies something strong. But we don't see it in income growth. We don't see it in jobs. We don't see it in credit growth. So how did it happen? Because this is a consumer-driven economy. And we don't see it in investment. What are the firms doing with their money? They're buying back their own shares. That's not investment. It's disinvestment. So the whole thing is very suspicious. It just may mean that in the second quarters it won't be 4%, but it may be positive. We won't know. Only John Williams knows enough about those numbers to know how realistic any of them are, because you have to spend your life studying all that stuff.
Yep.
But the third quarter, what happens third quarter?
Surprise.
If second quarter growth is due to involuntary inventory accumulation, then the same amount of buying and stocking up and production won't take place in the third quarter. And so there won't be anything there. So I don't think that we've had a recovery. I don't think anything has improved since the downturn in 2008, or just minimum improvement. But the economy went down, and it's mainly bouncing along where it was. It stopped going down. And the real fear is when it starts going down again, because they have no policy. We've seen that these 5 or 6 years of quantitative easing, however long it's been, this is massive money creation. These are massive deficit creation. So in terms of the post-war economic policy of Keynesian demand management, this has been the most expansionary policy in American history, and has had no effect in raising the economy.
And gold's flatlining for now.
And gold is flatlined only because the price is set in a paper market that the government can manipulate, or that the bullion banks working for the government and for their own profit can manipulate. But what normally you would expect, if the price of gold is falling, you would think, oh, this means the demand for gold is falling. But that's not the case. We see the imports in Asia have been exploding. The Chinese have been buying it up by the bucketfuls, And the Indians had to put quotas on it just because the Indians were buying so much gold, it was causing a deficit in the Indian trade balance. And we prevailed on India to try to stop that growth of that market. So they put quotas on how much gold China has. And so the real demand for gold is rising strongly.
And as you've said in the past,
and yet the price,
up.
and yet the price isn't. And the price isn't because the price is set in a market that the government can rig, because it's not a market that gold is actually traded, not real gold, but paper claims on gold. And these claims, when they come due, they settle them in cash. You know, I keep wondering one day, is Russia or China going to get angry enough or catch on? And they go into the COMEX and they buy all of these contracts.
And say, roll it out here, deliver it.
They just buy all of these contracts and then they demand delivery when the contracts come due. They say, okay, no, we don't want cash settlement. Give us gold. They wouldn't be able to deliver.
Is that coming, in your opinion?
If they want to really bug us, now they might not want to be that aggressive. I don't think Russia or China want war. They don't need a war to succeed.
Yeah.
And they don't have an ideology of taking over the world. Only Washington has the ideology of hegemony over the world. That's the neoconservative. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
That's the neoconservative ideology. Only the United States has this, we are going to take over the world. At least you're going to do what we want you to do. It doesn't mean we're going to put troops in your country, but you're going to follow our lead. You're not going to have an independent policy from the United States. Russia and China don't have that approach at all. They have, communism is gone. We used to say, oh, the communists are going to take over the world. Well, they're gone. And so it's not a threat from Russia or China. They don't want a war because they're not trying to take over the world. But the United States neoconservatives, they say that we are chosen by history. We're the exceptional, indispensable people, and that we have a right and a responsibility to establish our system over the world. And so this is the cause of all of this war, the cause of this antagonism toward Russia, because they're rising power. And how can you have hegemony if you've got another rising power, or you've got two rising powers, China and Russia? And so we have to knock down these rising powers. And so that's what all the conflict is coming from. It's coming from this neoconservative ideology. Now think about this, Greg. It's a handful of people, a handful of ideologues. They've created an ideology that's endangering the whole world. And, it's nonsensical. And they get away with it. Congress didn't say, wait a minute, what's going on here? The president, the White House, nobody, the media. There's almost no discussion that we are acting out a crazed ideology that somehow we have the right to rule the world. And this is not going to work. And it's going to lead to war. There's no way to avoid the war. Sooner or later, if this ideology continues to be our operative principle, right now it is the determining force of American foreign policy. And so it's going to keep pushing Russia and China until they have to strike back. And that is the danger. People need to be aware of this. It's so much more important than Ukraine or airliners or sanctions, or all of that is consequence, tiny little consequences of this ideology. This is the driving force in the world, and it's endangering the world. And people have got to learn about it and understand it. It's almost like now the United States has the rabid Marxist ideology of world domination. That's, in other words, what we used to say we had to fear from the Soviet Union. That's the way the United States is behaving. I don't think the Soviet Union ever behaved that way. I don't think they ever did. But it was the It was the way we represented them. You know, the notion of world revolution, world communist revolution, that was Trotsky. And Stalin got rid of it. Stalin said, no, socialism in one country.
And with that, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, your fine website, it's paulcraigroberts.org. Is that correct?
That's it.
And you live and die on your donations. And just to let people know that if they want to help you out and like your content, which you produce a lot of content. I mean, I'm sure what we've talked about is future content that you haven't even done yet because the situation on the ground moves so fast. But thank you so much for coming on USAWatchdog.com and taking us to school and giving us your perspective on the world, the geopolitical, economic situation. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, for coming on USA Watchdog.
Always enjoy it.